Episode 11, Part 11, Chapter 10. Chapter 10.
Cloud. I don't understand a word he's saying.
Tifa murmured softly. She was speaking to herself. The doctor and his assistant were in the room next door, discussing who knew what. They were worried about her, she knew, for she had slept little and had returned to the hospital that morning pale and drawn. The concern had been visible in their eyes. Tifa sank wearily into her chair and gently took hold of Cloud's hand. There had been no change in his condition, the Mako poisoning remained. His face was still pale and his eyes remained glazed and unseeing. His words were garbled, like he was trying to speak but couldn't quite make the words take form. At times, usually when she was nodding off, Tifa fancied she could see recognition in his blue eyes, but it was just her imagination. Another thing she knew was that the doctor was more worried about her than he was for Cloud. Despite his assurances and kind words, Tifa knew what his real thoughts were. To him, Cloud was already lost. He and the nurse did everything they could, but in truth they believed it was only a matter of time. Despite her efforts, Tifa was beginning to believe it as well. It was beginning to look like nothing would be able to rouse Cloud from his feverish hell. She had tried talking to him. She told him stories of their childhood. She talked about the day she arrived in Midgar, and how she met Barrett and the other members of Avalanche. She talked of the Seventh Heaven, and of Marlene. She tried to talk of Nibelheim, but each time she tried Sephiroth's words rung like giant bells in her heart, and she found herself unable to carry on.
I'm such a fool.
Tifa said sadly, her head sinking to her chest. Her dark hair fell over her face, hiding the tears that were welling in her eyes. She closed her fingers tightly around Cloud's hand.
I thought there was something I could do for him.
A soft, almost inaudible muttering made her lift her head. She watched as Cloud rolled his head to one side, away from her. His eyes were wide and unblinking, seeing a world only he could see. He croaked, his throat dry.
What? What number am I?
Tifa fought back the tears and continued her solitary vigil.
HMMN, now this is something,
said the old man, nursing a freshly made mug of tea with aged, gnarled hands.
I never thought anyone would ever climb up here.
Lifting the mug to his lips, he took a long, deep gulp. When he was done, he put the mug down on the old oak table and leaned back in his chair to take in the group of youngsters who were gathered before him.
Any minute now, this will be a battlefield against Shinra. You had better get down before you get involved.
Sid's brow furrowed.
A battlefield? We can't overlook that.
Behind him, Barrett cursed.
Shinra? The hell those jackasses doing here? Shinra again?
Red 13 sighed and shook his head. The old man raised an eyebrow.
It appears you have a problem with Shinra, too,
he said. He did not seem surprised at this. There were few people in the world these days who supported Shinra. He picked up his mug again and took another long sip, and Sid suspected there was more than just tea in there.
After all, you climbed up here.
The old man continued when he put the mug down again.
Why not listen to what I have to say for a moment? All right, talk on,
said Sid. He reached for a cigarette.
Do you know what's at the top of this mountain?
Sid stopped in the middle of lighting a match and gave the man a level stare. Was this a trick question? It was not hard to miss what stood on top of the mountain. The settlement in which they stood was built on top of a small mountain in the southern part of the Condor Plains, about half an hour's flight from the port town of Junon. It was originally built and owned by Shinra, and housed one of the company's first and oldest Mako reactors. The reactor was built on the mountain's peak. On a clear day it could be seen from miles away, another eyesore on the face of the planet. Also on the mountaintop was the reason for which the settlement had gotten its name. A giant condor lived there, perched on top of the reactor. The condor had made its nest there after Shinra left, and it had been there ever since. Because of this, the people of the settlement fondly referred to their home as Fort Condor. The people currently living in Fort Condor had made the settlement their home not long after Shinra had left. The citizens were made up of all types: farmers, builders, merchants. Even then, it was a far from easy life. The withered land surrounding the mountain made it difficult for farmers, they had to travel a few miles out to reach fertile land. It was worse for the builders and the merchants, who had to travel as far as Jinan to conduct their business. But the people of the settlement were happy. They had lived happily and peacefully for many years with hardly any trouble from the Shinra, who seemed to have forgotten about the reactor. Now it seemed things had changed. Barrett crossed his arms.
Hey! Something's up there.
Besides a reactor and a condor, he wanted to add, but didn't.
No matter how you look at it, that's a reactor,
said Sid.
And on top of it, is that the condor? I can see you're very perceptive. Yes, it's a reactor and a condor.
The old man smiled broadly, pleased that they had remembered the condor living on top of the mountain.
Looks like there's a special materia up in the Mako reactor. Then came the condor, so Shinra dispatched troops to get rid of it.
His face flushed red, and his hands gripped the mug tightly.
Their plan is to get rid of the condor and the people on this mountain and to get the materia from the Mako reactor. Unfortunately, we don't have the ability to fight Shinra ourselves,
the old man continued with a sigh.
That's why we have hired soldiers to help us. As our sponsor, you can help us with a contribution or by fighting alongside of us.
He looked up at Sid, his eyes bright and eager.
What do you think? You want to join us in our fight?
Sid put his cigarette back in its packet and scratched his head. He had to admit, he was touched by the old man's story. It further proved the lengths that Shinra were prepared to go to achieve their goals. Not content with destroying the settlers' livelihoods, they were also prepared to destroy the condor, which had made this place its home. Sid was far from being the sentimental type, but even he found himself sharing the old man's anger.
If you go that far, what can I say?
He said, turning to look at the others for their opinion. The looks on their faces said it all. It was a unanimous decision. Sid turned back to the old man.
Well, we'll be able to do something if you leave it up to us. Hey! We'll come to the rescue,
said Barrett. He was already fired up, excited at the thought of battling Shinra one-to-one. The events of North Corel had been a pleasant distraction, but there had not been enough soldiers to satisfy Barrett. A full-on onslaught against an army of soldiers. That was more like it. Red 13 nodded and flexed his long, black claws, scraping them against the rock.
Got it. I'm gonna lend a hand, too.
The old man smiled once more and returned his attention to his mug of tea. Sid and the others made a quick circuit of the settlement before making their way up to the battlements, which was situated at the top of the mountain near the reactor. It was not really a battlement so much as a wooden hut with slitted windows. It did provide a good view of the land surrounding the settlement, with the view stretching as far as the Western Ocean. The lookout was already waiting for them. Word of their cooperation had already spread among the villagers, no doubt thanks to the old man and his suspicious mug of tea. The lookout was a tall, burly man in his early 30s, with a bald head and skin that was deeply tanned from months of working in the sun. A crafter by trade, he had been forced to take up other work in these times of unrest. Although he stood as tall as Barrett, he had to stand on a stool to see out the windows.
So shall I let you in on our strategy?
The lookout asked once the introductions had been made.
The enemy is targeting this mountain's reactor and will be climbing to reach it. We must set a trap and hire soldiers to protect the place.
He turned to the window and signaled for Sid to join him. Sid climbed onto the stool next to him and looked out. Gathered outside were a small handful of mercenaries, no more than 5 in total. Sid turned and cast the lookout a skeptical glance.
Well, this is all we have.
The lookout seemed embarrassed.
This village doesn't have any money. Even if we wanted to fight, our hands are tied 'cause we're broke. To hire one soldier, we need 400 gil. So, if we hire 20 soldiers, we must have 8,000 gil.
He scratched his bald head.
That is, we would like you to use your own money to hire these soldiers, buy the trap, set it up and give the commands.
Sid shot him another skeptical glance. The lookout simply smiled back at him shamefacedly. Sid sighed heavily. What the people of Fort Condor were really looking for was somebody with enough money to fund and fight their battle for them. For a brief moment Sid regretted agreeing to help them. It wasn't as though they were broke, they had plenty of money stored in the Highwind, but he didn't particularly want to waste their money hiring soldiers.
We know that what we're asking is selfish,
the lookout added quickly, seeing the look on Sid's face.
We sent our wives and kids to another village. We are resigned to our fate.
Sid flushed guiltily. It seemed there was no other option. They would have to fight. The lookout brightened.
Let's get back to square one. If the enemy penetrates this shed, you'll have to fight them off immediately. I know it's a one-shot deal, but I'm asking for your help. Now then, is there anything you wish to ask?
Enough, said Sid, sighing. There was nothing else that needed to be said. The few mercenaries that they had managed to find were already here and, judging by the anxious look on everyone's faces, it would not be long before Shinra arrived and the onslaught began. There was no time left to find more fighters, and Sid doubted the villages would join in the battle. It was up to them to protect Fort Condor. The lookout turned to the window. His expression turned serious, and he looked over his shoulder at Sid.
Ready?
He asked. Sid also looked out. Far in the distance, marching steadily towards them across the Condor Plains, was the Shinra army. They were a black mark on the green countryside, a perfect match for the other eyesore that was the Mako reactor on top of the hill, which doubled as a dark beacon for the Shinra army to follow. Sid pursed his lips tightly and closed his fingers around his spear.
Okay, ready,
he said.
This is the deciding battle,
the lookout said, a nervous tremor in his voice.
The enemy numbers more than ever before.
It was less than an hour before the Shinra army reached Fort Condor. Due to the steepness of the mountainside on which the fort rested, the army had been forced to march round to the southern side. Here the ground was smoother and easier to climb, making it the perfect striking point for the army. It was clear that Shinra did not expect to meet with much resistance from the villagers. They had sent only a single platoon, marching 50 strong, to fight for control of the settlement. The army was mostly being used as a show of force, an attempt to intimidate the villagers and force them to surrender. Of course, the army would have no trouble in eliminating any who were foolish enough to try and defend the settlement. Marching along with the army was one of the Weapons Development Department's proudest creations. To Sid and the others, standing on top of Fort Condor, it looked like a large robot. In reality it was a highly advanced battlesuit, designed by Scarlet herself. It stood twice the size of the ordinary soldiers, was heavily plated, and carried stronger weaponry than all of the soldiers put together. Inside the suit was an ordinary soldier, likely the general in charge of the attack force. Scarlet had never liked soldier. They held no use for her. It did not matter how much Mako they had been infused with, or how advanced they were in the eyes of Hojo and the rest of the science department, they were still ordinary little people in Scarlet's eyes. A soldier's true strength, she believed, lay in the power of the weapon he held in his hands. The battle suit was one of her proudest creations. It certainly had its desired effect on the men of Fort Condor. The villagers were not cowards, they had managed to fend off Shinra attacks on their settlement before. But the sight of the battlesuit, along with the rest of the Shinra platoon, preparing to march up the mountain towards them, left more than one feeling a little nervous. Red 13 padded up beside Sid, who was watching the army assemble at the foot of the mountain from outside the hut.
I have spoken with the mercenaries,
he said in his soft voice.
They have agreed to go along with your plan. They don't have much materia of their own, so they will provide a front-line attack along with Vincent, Barrett, and I. Yuffie and Cat Shi will stay near the top of the mountain to provide materia support and activate the traps.
He smiled.
It took a while to get Yuffie to agree.
Sid said nothing. He continued to watch the army. The hound followed his gaze. The army was almost assembled. The sound of the general's voice could be heard even from up here. He was issuing commands to his men, who were hurrying to get into position. It would not be long before they began to climb the mountain. There were 50 soldiers in all, and only 11 of them, including the mercenaries. Red 13 sat down on his haunches, and his tail began to swish and sway through the dirt.
We are grievously outnumbered,
he admitted reluctantly,
but we do have the advantage.
He gazed around.
The terrain is steep and this is the only way up the mountain. It is a narrow battlefield, so the enemy will only be able to climb a few at a time. Cat Shi tells me these soldiers come from Jinan, so they will still be shaken after the attack from weapon. He says if we take out the general, it is likely the rest of the soldiers will run. How accurate his information is?
He shook his head.
Yeah, once a member of Shinra, always a member of Shinra.
Sid took a long puff of his cigarette and sighed, letting the smoke blow away in the breeze.
Well, there ain't no use worrying about it now. Whatever will be, or so they say.
He turned to Red 13.
Well, let's get moving,
he said, giving the hound a pat on the head before walking off to join Vincent and Barrett, who were just coming out of the hut with the rest of the mercenaries. Yuffie came out of the hut after them, carrying Cat Shi in her arms.
Now, you guys better be careful, you hear me?
She was saying sternly. She shook a determined fist.
And don't you worry about the traps, alright? We've got your backs. And remember, if you get in trouble, just call me, and I'll
Cat reached up and clamped a paw over her mouth. Ignoring her angry mumbles, he said,
Remember, the whole Shinra army has been disorganized since weapons started attacking. The general is the only thing keeping this army together. Take him out, and the whole army will crumble. You got that, lads? But he's all dressed up in that damn metal suit.
Barrett sputtered, spitting in anger.
How the hell are we supposed to get to him?
Before Cat could answer, an ear-splitting horn blast filled the air. Everyone, including the mercenaries, turned and looked down the mountain. The Shinra army was assembled, and at the sound of the horn, the first patrol began to make its slow climb up the mountain. Cat Shi scratched his head.
That's something you're going to have to figure out on your own, I'm afraid.
When Barrett glared at him, the cat added,
Well, I am still in Shinra. I can't give you all our secrets, you know. What would be the fun in that?
It took every ounce of Barrett's strength to restrain himself. The temptation to smack the cat out of the ninja's arms and then throw him headfirst into the oncoming army was almost too great to bear. Luckily at that moment Vincent tapped him on the shoulder, drawing his attention back to the events at hand. Sid was beginning to head down the mountain after the mercenaries, with Red 13 padding at his side. Barrett shook his fist at the cat before following them down. The first patrol was marching steadily up the hill. They marched in groups of 4, spread out across the narrow path that wound its way up the mountain towards the settlement. When they reached the midway point, the first 2 lines of soldiers dropped to their knees, raised their rifles, and opened fire. The response from the rebels was immediate. The 5 mercenaries launched into action, drawing their weapons and charging down the mountainside into the battle. They dodged the bullets with practiced ease, weaving in and out of the line of fire. Within moments they reached the front line of soldiers and smashed straight in, blades slashing through the air. Sid and the others were not far behind. The landscape was steep and uneven, making running immensely difficult. Even Red 13, with his padded paws and sharp claws, had difficulty keeping a firm grip on the ground. Bullets began to rain down from the sky, whizzing past their ears. A gap appeared in the rain of bullets as the soldiers on the back lines paused to reload. Seeing his chance, Vincent pulled ahead of the others and leaped into the air. He drew his short barrel and fired on the soldiers from above. His aim was perfect. 4 soldiers had fallen before the army realized they were being attacked from above and lifted their guns to the sky. A bright light filled the sky. The light was so piercing that many soldiers cried out in pain and were forced to shield their eyes with their weapons. When the light faded and they could see once more, they looked back up into the sky and wished instantly that the light had taken their sight forever. In those few moments when the battlefield had been filled with light, Vincent had changed himself from his human form into the powerful form of the Galleon beast. It was the sight of Galleon descending from the sky that caused the soldiers to cry out in fright and attempt to scurry away. Galleon slammed into the ground, in the midst of the Shinra army. The impact caused by his monstrous form caused the ground to shake, and all those on the back lines froze in fright. One soldier managed to gather enough courage to raise his rifle, but Galleon knocked the weapon out of his trembling hands before he could fire. Galleon raised his head and roared, and then charged headfirst into the scrambling army. Red 13 followed Vincent's lead by leaping up over the soldiers. He used their helmets as footholds as he jumped from head to head, trying to reach the inner ranks. A flash of orange light caught his eye. Quickly he leaped to one side. A large fireball sailed past him, brushing his flanks and singing the fur. Red 13 dug his front claws into the helmet of the hapless soldier he landed on, twisted his body round, dug his back claws in and then jumped in the direction of the soldier who had cast the fire magic. That soldier did not have the chance to cast another spell before Red 13 was on him, his jaws locked around the soldier's arm. He held on tight until the soldier finally relinquished the materia-powered weapon he had been holding. Only then did he let go, and jumped away and back into the fray. He was in mid-leap when a barrage of bullets sailed beneath his belly, and another handful of soldiers fell. The hound twisted his body and clamped his claws into the helmet of another soldier. He looked around and then leaped off in another direction. The heavy gunfire was coming from Barrett. The former rebel leader was standing on top of a large rock, shooting down the soldiers from afar. There was a fired-up glint in his eyes as he took down one soldier, then another, and another. His diversionary tactic worked, as the captain in charge of the first group ordered those men who were not currently engaged with the rebels to turn and open fire. This made an opening for Sid, who until then was surrounded on all sides. As some of the soldiers turned, he swung his spear and knocked them aside, and then dived out and continued running down the mountainside. The Shinra captain saw Sid's dash and ran to intercept him. Reaching out, he grabbed hold of Sid's scarf and yanked it hard. Sid croaked and tumbled backward, his head slamming into the rock. While he lay there, stunned, he felt a heavy weight crush his chest. Sid opened his eyes. The Shinra captain was standing over him, his boot pressed against Sid's chest and keeping him pinned down. Sid tried to swing his spear, but realized that his hand was empty. The spear lay a few feet away, thrown from his grasp when he fell. The captain raised his rifle and aimed at Sid's head a direct shot. The pilot closed his eyes tight. There was the sound of a gunshot, and an agonized cry filled the air. Sid opened his eyes once more and looked to his left. The captain was on the ground, clutching at his leg, which was encased in ice. Part of the ice was stained crimson where the bullet had landed. As Sid scrambled to grab his spear, the captain reached for his gun. Sid got there first. He snatched his spear off the ground and swung it with all the strength he could muster. It connected with the captain's head with a loud crack. The captain crumpled, his fingertips resting on the rifle. Sid looked at Barrett and waved a hand in thanks. He was just about to take a breath when he heard a terrible roar behind him. Sid spun around in time to see Galleon pounce on the back of a soldier who had been sneaking up behind him. The soldier fell to the dirt with Galleon on top of him. The beast took the rifle from the soldier's quivering hands and crushed it in his vice-like grip. He then climbed off the soldier, who scrabbled back and then ran back down the hill as fast as his legs could carry him. He was not the only one. The rest of the surviving soldiers were hurrying back down the mountainside at great speed, overwhelmed by the surprising strength of the rebels. 2 of the mercenaries gave chase, not wanting to let their prey escape. Seeing the soldiers flee, Sid leaned over and breathed deeply. His head was beginning to throb painfully. Being a leader was harder work than he thought. Galleon came over to stand by Sid. His eyes scanned the landscape.
It is no time to rest yet,
the beast said in a guttural voice entirely different to Vincent's own deep baritone.
The battle has only just begun.
Sid spat.
Shit. I know that. I was just getting my breath, that's all. Perhaps you're getting too old for this.
The pilot snapped his head round. Was that a smirk on Galleon's face? He was just about to make a comment on this when a second horn sounded. Sid turned and looked back down the mountain, Galleon at his side. The soldiers from the first wave had regrouped with the rest of the army, and now the second wave was beginning to make its way up the hill towards them. Marching at the back of the group was the general, encased in his battle suit.
I sure hope Yuffie's got those traps ready,
Sid muttered under his breath. He reached for his cigarettes. He lit one and took a long drag.
Otherwise, we're toast.
End of chapter. Episode 12, Part 11, Chapter 11. Chapter 11. The battle for Fort Condor went on until well into the afternoon. The air was filled with the sounds of gunfire and magic. The noise of the battle could be heard for miles around. The smaller monsters of the Condor Plains, terrified by the unusual noise, hid in their forests. The larger ones began prowling the withered land, waiting for the battle to finish. It was not going well for Sid and his group. The second wave was larger and had more advanced weaponry and materia than the first group had. The second wave was also made larger by the remnants of the first joining their ranks. It was not long before they had Sid and the rebels on the defensive, trying to halt their advance. The Shinra general fought alongside his soldiers, staying near the back of the army and out of reach of attack. His battle suit was heavy and difficult to move about in, especially on the slanted ground. He kept a small number of soldiers close to his side for extra protection as he used the suit's Mako-powered guns to fire at the rebels. The shells were made out of pure, condensed Mako. When the shells were released they shot through the air like miniature meteors, leaving long, glittering trail of Mako energy behind them. These shells exploded on impact, a huge explosion that made the ground tremble and sent dirt and rock flying into the air. One such shell landed close to where Sid and one of the mercenaries were fighting, trying to halt the enemy's advance. The resulting explosion threw them off their feet, along with a number of the general's own soldiers. The pilot hurried to his feet and swung his spear, knocking aside a soldier who tried to run past when he was down. The soldier staggered back, and the mercenary finished the job by swinging his heavy broadsword. The soldier managed one more step before he fell down, dead. Sid stuck the butt of his spear into the dirt and looked around. The army was still advancing and at least 2/3 of them were still standing. Bullets of ice and lightning and giant balls of fire were sailing through the air on both sides. Vincent had been forced to ditch the form of the Galleon beast and was weaving through the enemy lines, trying to dodge the enemy's attacks. Red 13 was cornered against a rock, snarling and snapping his jaws at any soldier who tried to approach him. Barrett he could not see, but by the sound of heavy gunfire, he was under attack as well. There was no other choice, it was time for the second part of their plan.
All right. It's time. Retreat. Run back to the hut.
He ordered, hoping the others could hear him over the gunfire. As he turned to run he saw Red 13 leap up onto the rock and scrabble away, even as gunfire trailed behind him. Vincent managed to find a path through the army and darted out, dashing up the hill. Barrett came out just behind him and followed the gunman back up the mountain. From other places behind enemy lines the mercenaries emerged, following Sid's orders. Seeing their chance of victory at hand, the Shinra army surged forward. The general stopped and watched, pleased, as his army charged after the rebels. The battle was as good as over. The hut was within their sights, and once the hut was taken, it was all over for the rebels and the people of Fort Condor. A large shadow fell over the soldiers. The general looked up in time to see a number of large boulders come hurtling through the sky, descending upon his soldiers, who ran on oblivious to the danger above them.
Look to the sky!
He shouted to his men, but he was too late. The rocks slammed into the earth, crushing every poor soldier who could not get out of the way fast enough. The boulders bounced and tumbled down the hill, rolling at high speed and tearing a line through the Shinra army. On top of the mountain, Yuffie cheered and shook her fist at the startled army.
Oh yeah. Gotcha. That's what happens when you take on Yuffie Kisaragi, the legendary ninja of Wutai. Fire again, cat.
Behind her, the cat huffed and puffed as he pushed another heavy rock into the catapult's sack.
Give me a chance here, lass,
the cat complained, wiping his furry brow.
These rocks are heavy, you know.
He gave the rock one final push, and it fell into the sack. The catapult strained beneath the weight. These wooden catapults were the traps the people of Fort Condor had set up to use in their fight against the Shinra. Situated at the top of the mountain, they made a good offensive weapon against any attacking army. The villagers knew that this path was the only way an army could reach the fort by foot, so they positioned all their catapults in two lines on the very edge of a jutting cliff, overlooking the sloping landscape. The catapults were filled with rocks and stones, broken glass and metal, anything they could find that could be thrown at the enemy. Yuffie had managed to find a good number of large rocks to use as part of her arsenal, but that wasn't the only weapon she had available. She had her own secret weapon, and was waiting for a chance to use it against the Shinra.
Fire!
The ninja ordered. Cat grabbed the rope and pulled, releasing the mechanism that fired the catapult. The head swung up and over, chucking the rocks up into the air. The remaining 5 catapults, manned by the men of Fort Condor, who came out to help after seeing the success of the first battle, fired just moments later. The Shinra army was in a panic. They were all clumped together and did not know which way to run to avoid the falling rock. The general solved their problem by raising his metal-encased arm and firing several Mako shells from his palm. The shells exploded on impact, blowing the rocks apart. The smaller rocks and showers of dust and dirt rained down on the soldiers, painful but harmless. Up by the hut, the villagers groaned in dismay. Red 13 shook his head.
This isn't good, he said. Those catapults are our last line of defense. If he can blow them to dust in a single shot, then there's no way we can continue to defend this place. Ah, quit complaining, sourpuss.
Yuffie snapped. She rubbed her hands together. Red 13 turned and cocked his head at her.
You think I haven't thought of that?
The ninja said with a wink.
You just watch this, you're gonna love it. Ah, quit complaining, sourpuss.
Yuffie snapped. She rubbed her hands together. Red 13 turned and cocked his head at her.
You think I haven't thought of that?
She said with a wink.
You just watch this, you're gonna love it.
The hound watched as Yuffie walked over to the nearest catapult, where Cat was tugging at the rope to pull it back into position. After helping him to secure the catapult's head, she reached into her pouch and pulled out a ball of red materia. Cat leaned over and looked at the red materia curiously. His ears twitched with interest.
Isn't that the Shiva materia? Didn't Tifa have that one?
He looked up at her accusingly. Yuffie's face was perfectly innocent.
What of it? She doesn't need it right now, and we do. Just get ready to pull the rope.
Cat shook his head and grabbed the rope. He watched as Yuffie reached behind her, presumably scratching her back. She then placed her hands over the catapult sack, one on top of the other, with the Shiva materia between them. She closed her eyes and concentrated. The Shiva materia began to glow and the air around her became crisp and cold. Her breath came out in cold puffs of steam and more icy clouds were beginning to rise from the materia in her hand.
Get ready,
whispered Yuffie, her eyelids half closed. The white light of the materia intensified, and the clouds began to form tiny, floating shards of ice. Yuffie watched closely as the light grew brighter.
Wait! Now!
She pulled her hands back sharply. Cat pulled on the rope. The head was released, and the sack swept up the growing ice shards and propelled them into the air. The ice took form as it rose, shaping itself into the beautiful ice maiden that was Shiva. Acting on the silent commands passed on to her by Yuffie at the moment of summoning, Shiva spread her arms out in front of her and called forth a giant wall of ice. The ice was shaped like an upturned bowl and descended rapidly on the soldiers, falling with a loud roar. Once more the general raised his arm. He fired 3 Mako shells at the ice bowl. They hit the bowl with such intensity that the ice shattered like glass. The general lowered his arm and watched with satisfaction as the broken shards fell to the ground like rain. The smile then left his face as he saw the true source of the roaring noise appear from behind the bowl, ready to strike. Behind the ice bowl was Leviathan. The water dragon burst out from where he had been hiding behind the ice, along with a giant torrent of water that had appeared when he was summoned. The roaring noise had been the water forming and striking the bowl of ice. Now that the ice had been cracked, the water had been unleashed, and was hurtling towards the enemy. The general started to order his men to brace themselves, but the command came too late. The water slammed into the ground with more force than the Mako shells, tearing up the very earth as it plunged down the mountainside. Leviathan roared, a terrible roar that pierced the ears of all who were within range. The water fell over the soldiers and swept them off their feet. The Shinra commander braced himself as the water struck. The strength of the current was incredible. It tore over him and around him. The weight of the battle suit kept it firmly on the ground, but he could feel the suit strain against the intense pressure. Through the rippling current he could see Leviathan slither past, unfazed by the current. For a brief second the general caught Leviathan's eye. The intensity of the dragon's eyes was just as strong as that of the water. The dragon swam so close that he brushed past the suit, almost knocking the general off his feet. The dragon swam up and out of the water, rising back into the sky. The water rose after him, following him up into the air. The dragon swam in an upward spiral, and the water copied like a shadow, swirling and churning, and moving faster and faster as the dragon rose. Light began to sweep down the dragon's body, covering his body in pure white light. The water dragon screeched and then vanished. At the same time the pressure of the rising water intensified and the water exploded, sending showers of water falling over the mountain. Yuffie twirled the Leviathan materia in her hands along with the Shiva materia. She had a smug smile on her face. The water fell over her and the materia, sliding down her face and arms. It slicked down the materia, and the droplets that fell on the Shiva materia froze into place. Yuffie placed both materia back into her pouch.
Well, that's the Shinra army dealt with,
she said cheerfully, turning back to face the others.
I'll leave the rest up to you.
She grinned.
Don't mess it up, okay?
The general was the only one left standing on the battlefield. The rest of his army had been carried off by the water and now lay scattered across the mountainside. Some soldiers had been thrown from the mountain entirely, and now lay injured or worse on the darkened land surrounding the mountain, helpless prey for the hungry fiends that were prowling the land. The general, realizing that he was now fighting alone, turned his attention back to the fort. The rebels were on the move again. Filled with renewed vigor, they charged back down the mountain towards him, ignoring the slick ground beneath their feet. Acting quickly, the general raised his arm and fired 2 Mako shells at the rebels. They dodged the shells and carried on moving, even as the shells exploded and made the earth tremble. Red 13 leaped over a large rock and pulled ahead of the others, his sharp teeth bared and glinting in the light. The general tried to fire a third shot, but as he tried the suit's arm made a loud popping and clinking noise and refused to fire. He looked down, and his eyes opened wide in horror. There was a long, deep gash in the battlesuit's metal plating, cutting right through the arm and exposing the electrical cables and Mako pipes that powered the arm. Electricity crackled from the exposed area. The general stared at the damage. When had this happened? He had been at the back of the army the whole time, well out of range of any attacks. Then he remembered Leviathan. The water dragon had brushed past him when the water had covered the mountainside. The scales that covered the dragon's body were stronger than diamond, and had cut through the suit as though it was paper. His attention was drawn back to the battle as he heard Red 13 roar. Quickly the general raised his other arm to shield his face as the hound leaped up at him. Red 13 lashed himself onto the general's arm and clamped his powerful jaws around the metal plating that covered his lower arm. In anger the general swung his arm, but Red 13 had a firm grip and was refusing to relinquish it. The general then began to hit the hound on the head with his other arm, delivering powerful, painful blows in an attempt to force the hound to let go. After a few brutal hits, Red 13 lost his grip on the battlesuit's arm. He yelped as the general gave him another hard strike to the shoulder and then tossed him aside. There came the sound of a gunshot, and a bullet pinged off his shoulder. Vincent jumped overhead and fired more shots that zipped past and bounced off his armor. The general turned and raised his arm to shield his face from the gunshots. As he turned, he saw a blur of movement through the corner of his eye. Sid was standing just behind him, swinging his spear in an attempt to knock him off balance. The general stepped back and ducked as low as the suit could manage. The spear swept over him, missing him by just an inch. Without pausing, the general lunged forward and up, bringing his clenched fist up to connect with Sid's unguarded chest. Sid cried out in pain as he was picked up and thrown back by the force of the punch. He landed on the dirt and skidded until he finally stopped, winded.
Sid!
Barrett roared in anger and used his gun arm to unleash a relentless attack at the Shinra general. The bullets clanged and pinged off the armor, denting the metal plating but never quite piercing it. He continued to fire, unyielding, keeping the soldier on his guard. Vincent landed on a rock and turned to face the Shinra general. Resting his gun on his forearm, he took aim and fired. The shot hit the suit's damaged arm, and the metal plating split apart. The plates fell away from the suit, leaving the general's arm and the Mako plates exposed and vulnerable. The general started to lower his arm, and as he did, Vincent another shot. The shot landed right in the gash made by Leviathan, going right through the metal and the general's arm beneath it. The general cried out in pain and staggered back, clutching at his injured arm. Smoke was billowing from the mechanics, and Mako was leaking from the damaged pipes, mixed with the soldier's blood. Desperate and outraged, the soldier started to run towards Sid. He did not get very far before Red 13 was on him. The hound leaped onto his back and closed his jaws around what would have been the soldier's neck if he had not been wearing the suit. The sudden appearance of the hound caught the general off guard and he staggered forward. Sid was back on his feet and, as the general lurched forward, he picked up his spear and thrust it out in front of him. The spearhead jammed into the gap between the suit's waist and torso plates. Red 13 relinquished his grip and leaped off as Sid pulled on the spear and lifted the general off the ground. Sweat poured down Sid's brow as he strained with the weight. Caught on the end of the spear, the Shinra commander was completely helpless. He struggled, trying to dislodge the spear from his armor, but the suit's weight kept him in place. Sid pulled the spear up and over, and on its descending arc he pushed with all his strength. The suit finally came away from the spear and the general was thrown into the side of a large jutting rock. Sid readied his spear and started to run forward, ready to end it.
Hold it! This guy's mine!
Sid stopped as Barrett charged past him, swinging his great, muscular arms. He caught the general just as he was trying to stand up. He slammed his gun arm into the visor protecting the commander's face, smashing it to pieces. He then swung his good fist, landing a devastating punch to the soldier's unshielded face. The general staggered back, his vision blurred by the blood that poured down his face. He tried to raise a fist to strike back, but one more punch from Barrett and the soldier was out for the count. He fell to the dirt, out cold. The battle was over at last. Seeing the Shinra commander lying harmlessly on the floor, Cat Shi left his place by the fort and ran down the mountain to join Sid and the others. He ran past them and went over to the unconscious commander and clambered onto the battle suit. He opened a hatch in the suit's chest and, after a rummage, pulled out a small, flashing electronic device filled with Mako. He jumped off the suit and faced the others.
This is the control unit for the battle suit,
he explained. He pushed a button on the unit, and the lights went out.
Without this, that suit is harmless.
The cat grinned.
Yes. We did it.
The lookout was almost leaping with joy. Sid and the others all stood, exhausted, inside the hut. They were a little worse for wear. They were covered in scratches and wet from the water, smeared with dirt and worn out from the lengthy battle. The remnants of the Shinra army, those soldiers who had managed to gather themselves together and return to the battlefield, had quickly fled when they saw their commander, stripped of his battle suit, lying tied up at the foot of the mountain. They had even forgotten to take their commander with them. Even though Sid and the others were exhausted, the people of Fort Condor were ready for celebration.
That was wonderful.
The lookout continued. He had a large smile on his face, and he clapped his large hands loudly.
Thank you. I doubt Shinra will attack now.
Sid took a handkerchief from his jacket pocket and wiped his forehead. It came back damp. Every muscle in his body ached with fatigue. Every movement sent racking pain throughout his body. He was looking forward to returning to the Highwind and taking a long, refreshing shower, and then a long sleep. Unfortunately, some part of his brain told me that he was going to have little time to do either. Still beaming, the lookout turned back to the window and looked out at the condor. The giant bird had stayed on top of the reactor throughout the entire battle, guarding its single egg, which was nested on top of the reactor. Unfazed by the actions of the humans below it, the condor had remained asleep during the battle. The lookout leaned against the wooden frame and looked up at the condor. Suddenly, the lookout's eyes opened wide.
Arg.
He choked. The condor was still there, sleeping peacefully on top of the reactor, with its giant wings half unfolded and shielding its egg from the garish light of meteor. The egg was sat upright, nestled in its resting place. The egg was colored unusual shades of violet, brown, and cream, and emitted an unearthly glow. As those inside the hut watched, a strong breeze began to blow outside. It swept aside the white clouds that dotted the sky, and a thick blanket of black clouds moved in to take their place. A dark shadow fell over the mountain and Fort Condor, until the only light that remained was the glow coming from the condor's egg. A crack appeared on the surface of the egg. The crack splintered and spread, growing larger and larger. Flakes of the shell began to float into the air through some unknown power. Still the condor slept, unaware. The cracks spread until they reached the bottom of the shell. At this point a bright white light burst from inside the shell, expanding until it covered the whole of the reactor. The light thinned and changed hue, forming a glowing sphere of violet light. What remained of the broken egg suddenly erupted into flames, flames that engulfed the roof of the reactor within seconds. The flames also swept up the chest of the condor, and it was at this the condor finally awakened, screeching in pain. The flames grew and grew until they filled the light sphere, swirling round and round, powered by an unknown force. A black shadow emerged from amongst the swirling flames. The shadow swirled within the sphere and started to take form. The form was that of a bird, a large bird with giant, flaming wings. The flames of the fire flickered and danced around the shadow, which flashed once and then vanished. The sphere of light dissipated, and the flames inside spread out into the air and then faded into nothing. The dark clouds that covered the sky also vanished, and the white clouds returned to the blue sky. The condor also turned to its sleeping state, and silence returned to the valley. Suddenly the condor raised its giant head and screeched painfully. It lost its grip on its perch and tumbled backward. It fell from the reactor and landed on the dirt below. The impact of its large body on the mountain made the whole fort shake, and a cloud of dust rose into the air. The motionless condor then slid down the side of the mountain. The final shards of the condor's egg fell away, and its contents glowed in the sunshine. The lookout gripped the edge of the window frame, leaning out as far as he could.
That light just now.
His voice was shaky, startled by the sight he had just witnessed.
The condor. The eggs. What?
He shook his head and turned to Sid.
Would you go outside and see what it was?
Sid was too tired to argue with him. He left the others and went out onto the mountaintop again. Following the markers that were signposted along the reactor, he went up to the top where the condor had made its nest. Pieces of the broken shell were scattered across the roof. Even though the place had been torched by flames, nothing seemed to have been burned. Sitting in the middle of the egg was a baby condor. Like its mother, it was much larger than the average condor, far bigger than Sid and his friends put together. The baby bird looked around the rooftop, then opened its beak and squawked hungrily. Sid felt sorry for it. The chick was unaware that its mother now lay at the foot of the mountain, out cold or possibly even dead. He hoped it was the former. As he watched the baby condor, a bright glint caught his eye. Sid lowered his gaze and looked at the ground a few feet from the condor's nest. Lying on the ground was a ball of materia. It must have tumbled from the nest when the egg cracked open, maybe even caused it. It was red materia, summon materia. Sid went over to it and picked it up. It was hot to the touch, almost burning, but even as Sid held it he could feel the strength return to his tired limbs. Steam rose from the scratches on his arms, and they started to heal. Sid stared at his arms, and then down at the materia. What kind of materia was this? Inside the materia's smooth surface, the image of a bird flickered past. Sid recognized the bird instantly. It was a well-known bird, popular in old folklore. It was a phoenix, a bird of fire whose flames could both heal and destroy. In this instance the materia had destroyed the shell that had contained it, engulfing the reactor in flames. But those flames had not burned anything else, and healed Sid's wounds when he picked it up. It was a very rare and very powerful materia. A high-pitched screech caused Sid to return his attention to the chick. The pilot watched as the baby condor spread its wings, which were large even though it was just a baby. He watched, astounded, as the newborn flapped its wings and rose out of its nest. These were no ordinary condors, to be able to fly so soon after being born. He watched as the chick flew once around the nest and then turned to the northern skies, flying off to find a new home. Sid returned to the hut, holding the phoenix materia in his hands. It was cooling down now. The others were waiting for him inside. They had also seen the baby condor, from the open window. The lookout was still peering out at the now empty spot where the condors used to be.
Gone?
He breathed. He lowered his head. Sid had a feeling that the lookout was more taken aback by the sight of the condor falling, and the birth of its chick, than he was by anything else he had seen that day. After a few moments the lookout raised his head and faced Sid, his face solemn.
Be sure to report to my father, too,
he said, and then returned to looking out the window, silent. The old man was still sitting at the table down below, continuing to nurse his mug of steaming tea. Sid and the others wondered if he had been sat there the whole time, even while the battle was going on outside. He looked up as Sid and his friends approached, and a wide smile spread on his face.
Everyone, thanks,
he said, the gratitude showing in his eyes.
I really mean it. Thanks. Although there isn't anything we can give you, we'll make sure you can stop in and stay any time, so be sure to drop by. Yes, and there's one thing I forgot to tell you.
He reached into his pocket and pulled out the huge materia. Sid looked down at it.
Hey? What's this?
He asked. Vincent's eyes opened wide in recognition.
This is... Damn, man, it's huge materia,
said Barrett. They all looked down at the huge materia. It was colored a deep crimson. No light seemed to shine within its crystalline surface, it was as dark as blood. The smile on the old man's face grew wider.
The truth is, this is the materia inside the reactor.
Sid looked at the old man and then at the huge materia. He looked at the old man again.
What the hell did we fight for?
He demanded accusingly. The old man held out the huge materia. Vincent stepped forward and took it from him, holding it carefully in his hands.
We weren't protecting the reactor,
he said.
We were protecting the condors. When that reactor was built, they forced us to help. That's how we knew what was inside the reactor. I knew this day would come, so after the Shinra left, I sneaked in and took the materia. I didn't mean to fool you, but I guess that's how it ended up. I'm really sorry.
Sid scratched his head.
Just forget about it. Anyway, we're still alive.
I see, the old man said. He stared thoughtfully into his mug.
If you put it that way. We're really grateful.
The pilot gave the old man a pat on the shoulder, and then turned to Katshi, who was back on his mog, still holding the control unit.
So the last huge materia that Shinra's after's in the underwater reactor in Jinan. We must get there before them and stop them,
said Red 13.
But you know,
Sid said, scratching his chin,
Shinra's probably on high alert since we always mess with them.
He scratched his chin a moment more, before facing the others.
How about we take a break and go see that little fella for a bit?
Barrett crossed his arms.
You mean Cloud?
Sid nodded.
Yeah, I'm worried about Tifa, she may have collapsed taking care of the guy. How about check in on M?
Before anyone could answer, he raised a fist.
Down to Midil.
End of chapter. Episode 13, Part 11, Chapter 12. Chapter 12. Sid and the others hurried back to the Highwind and set off for Midil, leaving the people of Fort Condor to their celebrations. It was unlikely that Shinra would attack the fort again after this, especially now that the huge materia was gone. Everything was just as they had left it when they arrived at Midil. The townsfolk were still going about their business, almost without a care in the world. They continued to ignore the sight of meteor in the sky, carrying on as though it was not there. Seeing the calm smiles on the people's faces made Sid and the others feel much calmer themselves, a nice feeling after all the fighting they had endured during the past 24 hours. Here, at least, things continued to be peaceful. Meteor had almost doubled in size in the past few days. It was now clearly visible across the globe, even as far away as Cosmo Canyon. Its fiery red aura pierced even the thickest clouds, making it appear as though the sky was ablaze. At night swirling, burning clouds could be seen on its surface. Yet even as panic grew in the hearts of the rest of the world, the people of Midil remained as they always had, tranquil. Sid and the others headed straight for the hospital, eager to see how Tifa and Cloud were doing. As they entered the clinic, they were met by the doctor. He could see the question burning in their eyes. He sighed regretfully and slowly shook his head.
I'm sorry,
he told them.
but your friend's condition remains unchanged. You'll have to be patient and wait this out.
He looked over at the door that led into the other room.
These things take time. Just like fine wine, time is of the essence.
The nurse put down the sterilized cloth that she was using to clean the counter and looked over at the group.
She's finally beginning to look a little tired. I hope she's all right.
She followed the doctor's gaze and sighed, before turning her attention back to her cleaning.
No change in his condition, and still stays there doing her best. It must be tough on her. If she keeps this up, she'll probably get sick.
Sid glanced at the door, and then at the doctor. The doctor smiled and nodded. Sid went over to the door and peered into the room. There was Tifa, sitting in a chair by Cloud's side. She held his hand in hers, stroking it tenderly. Sid stood in the doorway watching her, and caught a glimpse of her face as she brushed aside a length of hair that fell over her eyes. The nurse was right, she did look tired. Caring for Cloud was a hard task, and it was starting to take its toll on her. She did not appear to have noticed him.
It's no use,
he heard her say.
I don't understand a thing, Cloud. What should I do?
Cloud didn't answer. Tifa clenched her fist, squeezing his hand.
What if you never recover for the rest of your life?
Sensing someone watching her, Tifa raised her head. She met Sid's gaze and smiled at him. She opened her mouth to speak. Suddenly the room shook. The windows rattled loudly in their frames, and the glass beakers and vials in the office started to dance across the counter. The ground trembled and quavered violently, causing everyone inside the hospital to lose their balance and fall to the floor. Sid gripped the side of the doorframe and held on tight. Books tumbled from shelves, and there was a loud smash as a beaker finally reached the end of the counter and crashed onto the floor, spilling its contents.
"Ah!"
screamed Tifa as she was thrown out of her chair. She pushed herself to her knees and clung to the side of Cloud's wheelchair, her eyes squeezed shut. Only Cloud was unfazed by the sudden quake. As his body jostled about in the chair, he took in a sharp breath and raised his wide eyes to the ceiling.
There. Coming.
He rasped. Sid's head snapped up to look at Cloud.
What did you say, Cloud?
Whatever it was that had taken hold of Cloud had already gone. By the time Sid looked, Cloud's head had already dropped back to his chest, and his eyes had returned to their glazed, unseeing state. He mumbled. Sid cursed and looked upward. The overhead light swung back and forth. Another beaker smashed in the next room.
Damn,
Sid said.
What the hell's going on? No way.
Tifa breathed, still on the floor by the wheelchair.
Is this?
Sid pushed himself away from the door and hurried back outside. Barrett and the others were already there, spread out in front of the hospital, trying to see what was going on. The whole town was in a panic. The buildings creaked and heaved, slates tore themselves from rooftops, and the air became thick with dust that rose from the ground. The townspeople, terrified, ran for their homes. One woman was almost killed as she ran for the nearest store when a slate fell from a nearby roof and landed by her feet. She hurried inside the store and slammed the door shut. A strong wind was beginning to blow through the town. It ripped through the surrounding forest, sending leaves and branches soaring through the air. It sent Sid's hair whipping about his face, and he shielded his eyes with his arm as he looked around the town. They were the only people left outside. Amongst all the rattling and the shaking, Sid heard a roaring sound like gushing water. The roar became louder as the ground gave an especially violent shake, causing it to almost jump upwards. Sid looked down. The roar was coming from deep beneath the surface of the planet. Somewhere below the planet's crust something had burst, and whatever lay beneath it was now fighting its way towards the surface.
What's this?
Gasped Sid, his voice drowned out by the roar of the earth.
The live stream is gushing up from below the surface of the earth.
A low wail began to drift through the air, and upon hearing it everyone froze in place. The sound sifted through the trees, rustling the leaves and touching the hearts of all who could hear it. It was a familiar sound, one they had heard before. It was the cry of the planet. The live stream gushing so close beneath the surface made it possible for them to hear its cries. Something was causing the planet to scream in pain.
Damn, that's...
Sid turned one way, and then another. The planet's cry was all sounding all around him, even inside him. He could hear it inside his mind, and it was as though he could hear the thoughts of the planet. Danger was coming. Sid looked all around him.
This is bad. Sid? What's wrong?
Sid turned back to the hospital. Tifa was standing in the doorway. The wind blew around her, whipping her long hair about her face. Bracing herself against the blustering wind, she stepped out of the door and headed toward Sid and the others.
Nothing.
The pilot answered quickly.
You and Cloud get inside quick.
The ground gave another stomach-churning lurch and Tifa stopped.
But
she began. Sid stopped her with a look. Then he smiled and said,
Hey, don't worry about a thing. I ain't about to die that easily.
He gave her a self-assured smile. Tifa stared back at him, her gaze level and steady. Finally, she nodded.
Be careful.
She warned him, and then ran back into the hospital. Once Tifa was safely inside the hospital, Sid reached behind him and unhooked his spear. He turned and slammed the butt defiantly into the ground.
Okay,
he announced loudly, facing the others,
here I go. Watch this.
Suddenly, Yuffie cried out. She clutched her razor ring close to her chest and pointed up towards the sky. Everyone followed her gaze and looked to the sky. There, flying over the forest surrounding Mideel, was weapon. It was a different weapon to the one they saw fighting the Shinra at Junon. This weapon resembled a dragon. They had seen this weapon back at the North Crater, when it and all the other weapons first emerged from their long sleep inside the planet. When it came out of the crater it had hovered alongside the Shinra airship. It had turned its draconic-like head and looked at the people standing on the deck. Its gaze had been chilling. The dragon-like weapon beat its two monstrous wings. The resulting windstorm they created sent more slates flying from the rooftops. Those on the ground tried to stay standing as the breeze whipped around them and threatened to blow them off balance. Weapon roared and soared over Mideel. The others standing behind Sid all drew their guns and other artillery and turned to face Weapon. It was up to them alone to fend off Weapon and protect this peaceful place. They could expect no help from the townsfolk, who were in their homes hiding from the still shaking earth.
Damn!
Sid swore.
That goddamn Weapon! Of all the times to show up!
He readied his spear, gripped it in his hands.
Okay then, come on! You fucker!
Ultimate Weapon, as this particular weapon was known, suddenly turned in the air and faced Mideel. It arched its small head down and looked at Sid and the rest of his crew, weapons in hand, ready to fight. Its eyes glinted red as it recognized potential victims of its might. It gave an ear-piercing roar and then tilted its wings, swooping down upon the humans below. Sid and the others stood firm as Weapon descended. They refused to budge an inch, even as the wind pushed and pulled at them and tried to throw them off their feet. Ultimate Weapon lifted its wings at the last moment and came level once again. It landed in the center of town, slamming its 4 large feet into the ground. It pulled its wings behind his back as it turned to face the humans that challenged it. Sid struck first, before Weapon could have a chance to attack. He lifted his spear and threw it at the monster. The spear hit Weapon on the shoulder and bounced right off, leaving nothing more than a tiny nick on its thick, leathery hide. Weapon glanced down at the trivial mark and then glared at Sid, who ran to retrieve his spear. Weapon raised a large, clawed hand to smash the pilot into the ground, but was stopped when a bombardment of bullets began to rain around it. Weapon watched as the bullets clanged and pinged off its torso, never doing any real harm. It then looked over at Vincent and Barrett, who stood together to launch a double attack against Weapon. Unfortunately many of their bullets missed their targets, as the shaking ground made it impossible for them to keep their guns level. Weapon lunged forward and brought its hand down once more. Vincent and Barrett lowered their guns and jumped back out of harm's reach. Vincent landed and charged forward, raising his gun and opening fire. He leaped onto Weapon's hand and ran up the beast's long arm. Weapon roared in irritation and tried to bat the gunman off, but it missed and Vincent kept on coming. The ground heaved violently once again. Weapon, still in mid-lunge, was caught off balance and lurched forward, steadying itself with one hand. Vincent reached Weapon's shoulder and jumped straight off. He twisted his body round and fired 3 shots at Weapon's head. Weapon roared in anger as the bullets hit, but the skin of its face was as tough as that of its torso, and they pinged off, leaving barely anything more than a scratch on its face. Regaining its balance, Weapon stood and turned, its tail lashing behind it. The tail slammed into the ground, narrowly missing one of the houses nearby. The tail then swept across the dirt-covered ground, towards Yuffie and Red 13. Hurriedly Red 13 darted out of the way, while Yuffie jumped and flipped backwards. Returning to an upright position out of the way of the lashing tail, the ninja readied her razor ring and ran swiftly to the left. She flung the razor ring away from her. The ring spun through the air, becoming a blur of movement, and arched towards Weapon. The ring zipped across Weapon's back and sliced a deep gash in the thick hide. Yuffie skidded to a stop and ran the other way, ducking down as Weapon's tail soared over her head. The razor ring came down in a declining arc. Yuffie caught it in her hand as it came by her, and kept on running. Weapon spread its giant wings, wings that were so long that they covered almost half the whole town. The monster lowered its head and opened its jaws wide. Sparks of pure light energy began to form in the air around its open mouth. The energy was drawn towards its mouth and into its throat, glowing brighter and more intense. Weapon clenched its fists and drew back its head, preparing to fire. Suddenly and without warning, the light vanished, and Weapon closed its jaws. It raised its head to the sky and looked towards the north, listening. On the ground, Sid and the others warily lowered their weapons and watched the beast, unsure of what they should do next. As they watched, Weapon lowered its head and spread its wings out once more. It gave them a powerful beat, and those on the ground quickly fell to their knees, shielding themselves from the wind and dust that blew around them. Weapon beat them once more, and its body began to rise up off the ground. It rose above the town and above the forest, until it hovered in the air. Then it turned and began to fly away from the town, heading north. Sid stared up in astonishment as Weapon flew away. He clenched his fists around the spear's pole.
"You fucker!"
he shouted after the dragon.
"You trying to escape?"
Weapon could not hear him over the wind, or he perhaps was ignoring him, but whichever it was, Weapon carried on flying until it disappeared over the rustling treetops. Sid started to walk forward, but suddenly stopped as the ground suddenly stopped shaking and became perfectly still. Sid looked down. The ground was completely still, almost eerily so. Cautiously, Sid took a step forward, testing the ground. It did not move. Then he realized that the bustling wind had also died, leaving the air still and motionless, like the calm before the storm. There was barely a sound. Beside the pilot, Red 13 took a deep breath and sighed heavily. He looked up at Sid and smiled. Yuffie, still staring at the sky, clutched her razor ring tightly in her hands.
"I swear, next time, that guy's dead meat,"
she announced fervently. To illustrate her point, she shook her fists furiously at the sky. Ignoring the ninja, Barrett turned to Sid and said,
"Looks like the live stream settled down now, too."
Just as he finished speaking, the ground began to shake again.
"You gotta be kiddin',"
Sid muttered, feeling his stomach churn again. He dug the point of his spear into the earth and used it to steady himself. In retaliation, the earthquake suddenly increased in strength. The quake was now much stronger than it was before, in fact the first one seemed almost mild by comparison. The ground lurched and heaved, and a loud cracking sound could be heard from beneath their feet. The roaring sound returned, much louder and much closer, as the live stream below began to swell and rise to the surface. The trees in the surrounding forest, torn from their roots, tumbled over. Sid clung onto his spear.
This is bad,"
he said.
"The mainstream is kicking up. Something way bigger than that last one is on its way."
The pilot let go of the spear and fell to his knees, struggling to remain standing.
"No good."
He took a firm hold of the spear and fought against the tremor. He pushed himself shakily to his feet, then turned to face the others and shouted,
"Get out of here!"
His voice could barely be heard over the growing roar.
"But what about Tifa and Cloud?"
protested Yuffie.
"God damn it! You don't have time to worry about anyone other than yourself,"
Sid said to the ninja crossly.
"You don't know when that stream will blow."
As if to prove his point, the ground at the northern end of town suddenly burst open. The rocky land split apart and a long crack formed. Clouds of steam billowed out from the widening crevice. The crack grew and spread into the forest. It forked into two and spread out in two directions that started to slowly circle the town. They watched in awe and horror as land dipped, tilting down into the crack. It was obvious what was happening. The life stream was exerting so much pressure that it was forcing the land to break apart, creating an opening through which to escape, like a volcanic eruption. When the two cracks that circled the town met on the other side, the ground would crumble and the entire town would fall into the life stream. One tree on the edge of town tilted and fell into the rising steam, vanishing from view. Cat Cheese Mog jumped about in a panic, its arms flailing. This made it difficult for Cat to keep his balance, and so he flopped down on his belly, clinging to the Mog. Sid's eyes opened wide.
"Whoa!"
he exclaimed.
"There's no time, hurry!"
Obeying his command, Barrett and the others turned and ran from the village. There came a loud popping sound as the land to the west of the village burst open, and more steam rose from the gap. Sid started to run after the others. Then he stopped and turned back to the hospital.
"Tifa! Cloud! Get out of here!"
Tifa was still inside the hospital, standing by Cloud's side. She somehow knew that weapon had shown up, and listened to the battle raging outside. Hearing the battle cease and the earthquake stop, she had thought for a brief moment that the danger had passed. Then the earthquake had started again in force, and this time she knew that nothing would stop it until the life stream reached its goal, the surface. Tifa lowered her eyes to the ground and shook her head. Her dark eyes were wide, and her brow creased in worry.
"This is bad. The tremors are getting worse."
She turned to Cloud.
"Wait a minute, Cloud,"
she said, before running over to the door. She clung to the frame as another strong tremor shook the building.
"Doctor! Shouldn't we move him somewhere rather than stay here?"
The doctor and his head nurse were in the main office, trying to salvage what texts and medicines they could from the medical cabinets. Upon hearing Tifa's voice, the doctor put down his books and turned to her, his face grave.
It might be an idea to take refuge in a wide open space,"
he agreed. He looked at the nurse, who nodded in agreement. The two turned back to the cabinets and began to stuff what medicines they could into their pockets. Tifa hurried back to the ward and knelt by Cloud's side, looking up at him. Somewhere outside she heard the sound of weapons roar.
"Don't you worry about a thing, Cloud. I'll see to it that you get somewhere safe,"
she told him. Once more the tremors increased in strength. The hospital creaked and heaved, shaking from its very foundations. A long crack split along the concrete wall, rising up from the floor and across the ceiling. The swinging light bulb overhead finally burst, unable to take the vast pressure coming from below. Tifa looked up as she heard the doctor's voice calling out to her from outside.
"No. The structure can't take it. Hurry."
"Yes," Tifa called back. She stood and hurried to stand behind Cloud. She took a firm hold of the handlebars and tilted the wheelchair back gently. Cloud's head tilted to one side. Tifa looked down at him.
"Ready, Cloud? We're leaving now."
She gave the wheelchair a push and led Cloud out of the building. Sid and the others were gone, and the doctor and nurse were nowhere to be seen. They had already fled to safety outside of the village. Tifa took a quick moment to look around before turning the wheelchair and beginning to make a hurried dash for the town exit. Tifa had just reached the bottom of the slope when the ground gave a thunderous roar and the path behind her cracked open. The ground pitched upwards and then dipped sideways, lifting the hospital into the air. Unable to hold onto its foundations any longer, the building broke free and slid across the ground. The life stream surged up from below and the hospital tumbled into it, the ground sinking swiftly behind it. Tifa didn't dare look behind her and kept on running. A second crack spread across the town, the fighter felt it zip beneath her boots. The ground tilted once more and another large chunk of the town fell into the life stream, this time taking a house with it. Dust rose into the air, thick and heavy, tickling Tifa's throat and making her want to cough. She fought against it and continued to push the chair. The exit was just ahead. A third and final crack appeared. This time it was in front of her, blocking her exit. It moved across the ground at high speed, curving and twisting and encompassing the rest of the town. The ground shuddered as it came loose and tilted sideways. Tifa skidded to a stop as a wall of dust rose to block the other side from view. She looked around, and her eyes widened in horror as she realized that there was no escape. Cloud remained fixed in his chair. His eyes were focused intently on the life stream that surged up from below, as though he was being drawn towards it. Another strong shudder caused the ground to dip, and the abruptness of the movement caused Tifa to lose her grip on the wheelchair. She cried out as the wheelchair rolled across the ground, pulling Cloud away from her. She tried to reach for him but failed. The ground tilted further and Tifa found herself sliding across the ground after him, heading for the edge. Cloud reached the rim first. The wheelchair toppled over the edge of the crevice. Cloud was thrown from the wheelchair and fell down towards the life stream, with Tifa following close behind. The two fell, tumbling and rolling, before landing with a splash into the glowing life stream. End of Part 11. Part 12, Memoria. End of chapter. Episode 14, Part 12, Chapter 13. Part 12, Memoria. Chapter 13. Everything was dark. Tifa was resting on a cushion of shadows, lying motionless and slowly spinning round and round as she descended deeper into the darkness. There was no sound, no movement. No breeze rustled her hair. The sound of her breath as she slowly exhaled was dull, as though the sound waves simply vanished upon leaving her body. Tifa lay there, perfectly still, her thoughts drifting. Was she dead? In her mind, she went back to those last few moments. The last thing she remembered was falling into the life stream. The water had closed around her like a warm blanket, warm, yet suffocating. She had been pulled down and down, deeper beneath its glimmering waters. Cloud was right beside her, his eyes closed as he, too, sank further. She had reached for him, desperately trying to hold on to him. Then everything had gone dark. After a few minutes of swirling about in the dark, Tifa finally awoke. She opened her eyes and stared ahead. She was unable to see a thing except for her own body. She lay there, staring into the darkness. Although she was unable to feel the movement, she could sense her body spinning. As she became more aware, the spinning began to slow down until she came to a dead stop, hovering in the darkness.
Where am I? What's happening?
Tifa blinked a few times, trying to force her sluggish mind into wakefulness. She took a deep breath and tried to stand up. Although she was unable to see anything, she felt the presence of a floor beneath her feet. Cautiously she rose to her feet, placing one foot gingerly in front of the other. The floor seemed stable enough. Tifa lifted her head and looked around. The darkness was impenetrable, she could not see a thing through it. She also realized, to her horror, that she was alone. Tifa's heart leapt to her throat.
Where's Cloud? Cloud, where are you?
She started to take a step forward, but stopped as a noise suddenly rang out in the darkness. She froze, listening intently. The noise was static. It was the same kind of static that could be heard from a radio that had not been tuned in. The sound came from all around her, coming from every single direction. Tifa felt it crackle around her, even through her, making her heart beat rapidly in her chest. Then, amidst the static and the noise, she thought she heard a voice. It was not a physical voice, nor was it a spiritual one. She could not explain it. It was as though the words just suddenly popped into her head.
Hey?
Tifa blinked, confused. She listened.
What? Wah.
She shook her head.
Who is it? I can't hear.
The static slightly increased in volume, and the floor beneath Tifa's feet started to spin steadily. Tifa listened as the words entered her head, harsh and accusing. She turned sharply.
Wait a minute. I don't know anything about that.
She shouted to the darkness. She turned back. The ground began to spin again. More words followed.
No.
Tifa protested.
It's not me. I'd never do anything like that.
The static grew in volume, this time to painful levels. Tifa cried out in pain and clamped her hands over her ears, trying to drown out the voice. It was a futile effort. The static continued to ring around her, piercing her mind, her body, and her soul.
No. Stop it. Stay back.
She started to run, trying to escape from the noise. It was impossible to tell if she was moving anywhere or if she was just running on the spot, for the darkness was so thick she could not see if the ground was moving. Still the sound rang in her ears, and she closed her eyes tight, pushing herself as hard as she could go. The sound followed her, relentless, screaming at her.
Somebody! Help!
Tifa called.
Please!
As she ran, she tripped and fell onto her knees. She opened her eyes again and stared down at the unseen ground, her mouth open, panting hard. Still the static around her crackled and shrieked with words only she could hear. Why? Why was this happening? And where was Cloud? Tifa couldn't understand it. What was this unseen voice that was shouting at her so accusingly? Was this the voice of the planet? Was it the planet that was screaming at her, condemning, demanding an answer? What did the planet think that she had done? Another sound penetrated the darkness. It was the sound of gunshots, numerous, loud and deafening. Tifa's eyes widened and she bit her lip as the shots rained around her, unyielding and unending. Fear clutched her heart as the pure black of the shadows slowly changed to a deep crimson, giving her the feeling that she was now drowning in a pool of thick blood. The sickening taste of iron filled her mouth. She coughed and gasped, trembling.
Cloud, help me!
She cried desperately. There was no answer, just the sound of the planet's angry, pain-filled cries. Tifa, beset by fear and pain, lost her strength and fell forward until she was lying flat on the ground. The terrain span again. The floor beneath her began to descend rapidly, carrying Tifa with it.
Iaioic!
When Tifa next opened her eyes, she found herself lying face down in a dimly lit area. The static had ceased, leaving the land eerily still and quiet. The ground beneath her was hard and uncomfortable. She stretched out a hand and touched it gingerly. It was rock, and it was definitely there this time. She sighed in relief. Slowly, carefully, Tifa pushed herself to her knees. Her head was pounding painfully. The sound of gunshots still rang in her mind, but they were beginning to fade now. Tifa tried to stand, staggered, and then stood upright.
Where am I?
She said aloud, and her voice echoed back to her. As she spoke, a light suddenly filled the room. It was as though someone had just turned the lights on. The whole area became filled with a bright white light, tinged with pale green. Tifa winced and rubbed her eyes. She blinked a few times to adjust her eyes to the light. Then she looked up and gasped. Hovering in the air not 10 meters above her head was Cloud. He looked different, his body was translucent, like a ghost. He was on his knees and writhing as though he were in pain. His hands were pressed against his head, and his eyes were squeezed tightly shut. She watched as he opened his mouth to cry out, but no sound came out. Tifa stepped forward, her eyes still fixed upon him.
Cloud? What is it, Cloud? What is this?
The fighter pulled her gaze away from Cloud and looked around her. She was standing in the middle of a large rocky platform, bathed in the strange white-green light. There was no ground supporting the platform, it seemed to hover in the air by some unknown force. As for the surrounding landscape, there was little. The scenery above, below, and around her was nothing more than a swirling, dark green cloud. 3 paths branched off from the main platform where Tifa stood, each heading off in a different direction. More floating platforms were at the end of each path. On these were things Tifa recognized from her memory, but she was distracted from these as she realized that there was a person sitting at the end of each path. The 3 figures had their backs to Tifa, but there was no mistaking that spiky blonde hair, or the soldier uniform they all wore. She started, awestruck. Each one of them was Cloud.
Is this the inside of your dreams? Or is it your subconscious?
Tifa looked up again at the ghost-like cloud that writhed in seeming pain above her. Then she lowered her gaze and looked at the other 3, from one to the other. She was beginning to understand just what this place was, and why she had been brought here.
You're searching, aren't you, Cloud?
She said.
Searching for yourself.
The fighter clenched her fist tightly.
I can help too,
she said. Her lips pressed together firmly, and she raised her eyes once more.
We'll work together to get the real you back. But where do we start?
Tifa turned and inspected each platform. Each one bore a significant event in Cloud's memory, of that she was sure. The platform ahead of her had an old wooden well in its center. The one to her right had a stone path leading into a town. The third was the strangest of all, for all it contained was a brick wall and a window. Tifa did not dwell on that one too closely, but she had a feeling she knew that window, somehow. She turned and looked at each in turn, wondering where to begin.
The gates of Nibelheim. 5 years ago, Sephiroth passed through these gates. And that's how it all started.
Tifa turned as the Cloud sitting by the town entrance slowly climbed to his feet. She went over to join him and stood by his side. Cloud's head was raised, looking up. Tifa followed his gaze. Hanging overhead was a familiar wooden signpost. The word Nibelheim was painted on it in big, black letters. Tifa stared up at it.
It connects to Nibelheim?
She asked. She nodded.
That's right. It's probably best to start from there.
Taking a deep breath, she walked forward and approached the stone path. She stopped at its edge and looked back at Cloud.
Let's go have a look, Cloud. I know it's not easy, but I'll be right with you.
Cloud did not move. He stayed rooted to the spot, staring into the town. Tifa smiled at him gently and then walked into the town. As soon as she stepped on the path, a gust of wind blew and ruffled her hair. Being carried on the wind were all sorts of smells, all of them familiar. It stirred the memories that Tifa had locked in her heart, and she thought she would not be able to continue. Her heart was stuck in her throat. She let the wind wash over her, taking it in, before swallowing the lump in her throat and walking into the town. Everything was just as she remembered it. Ironically, this town was identical to the current Nibelheim, the one that Shinra had built after the fire. But her feelings for this Nibelheim were different from the feelings she felt for that Nibelheim. She had felt betrayed looking at the other Nibelheim. Shinra had created it, after trying to eradicate everything that linked it to Shinra and Sephiroth. It was no longer her home. Every person, every memory, everything. They had all been erased. But this town that she saw now. This was the Nibelheim she knew.
Cloud. Look.
The fighter ran forward and stopped underneath the signpost. She looked further inside. The whole town was there. She could see everything as she had done years ago. There was her house on the other side of town, with Cloud's house just next door. In the center of town, she saw the old well.
Here's the well,
she said, and then turned to her left.
And that's Gramps' Inn, too.
She turned and ran over to an old truck parked just outside the town gates. Fondly she laid a hand on it.
The only truck in town,
she said, and her eyes filled with memories.
It's been here since we were little kids, right? This is the Nibelheim you remember, right?
She looked up at Cloud. He still stood outside of the town, his eyes following her every move. Tifa smiled and nodded.
It's the same as my Nibelheim,
she told him.
That's why this place is our Nibelheim.
Tifa walked away from the truck and returned to the gate. A shadow appeared where she had stood, sitting by the truck. It was a shadow of Cloud. The darkness receded, leaving only Cloud behind. He stood slowly, his blue eyes glazed as though he were in a dream. He looked at Tifa distantly, and then looked down at the ground.
5 years ago, 2 men from Soldier came,
began Tifa. She looked once more into the town.
Sephiroth and a young and vibrant soldier.
Turning away from the town, she looked at Cloud.
Can you tell me again what happened?
The Cloud standing before her vanished and then reappeared by the town gate. Tifa joined him, standing on the other side of the gate. A third figure appeared between them. It was Sephiroth. He looked so real that it was hard to believe he was nothing but a memory. The soldier raised his head and looked at the town, his face impassive. Then he turned away from the town and spoke to the empty air.
How does it feel?
He asked.
5 years ago,
Tifa began.
I saw the real Sephiroth for the very first time.
Cloud looked at her, and then turned his eyes to Sephiroth. Tifa did the same. She tried to recall her first impressions when she first laid eyes on the tall, silver-haired man who, back then, was one of Shinra's most famous and highly prized members of Soldier. There were few back then who did not know the name of Sephiroth, much less speak his name without feelings of awe and envy. Even in this country town, Sephiroth's name was spoken with awe. It was soldiers like Sephiroth, and other top-ranking soldiers, who made men aspire to join Shinra's elite army, Soldier. All of this went through Tifa's mind as she watched Sephiroth speak once more to the empty air.
It's your first time back to your hometown in a long time, right?
Said Sephiroth.
So how does it feel? I wouldn't know because I don't have a time.
Another voice then spoke, echoing in the air around Tifa. She also saw, in the corner of her eye, Cloud's lips moving in unison with the words, speaking out the memories.
How about your parents?
At this, Sephiroth crossed his arms and looked down in thought.
So this is the great Sephiroth,
Tifa whispered. After a moment's thought, Sephiroth finally spoke.
My mother is Genova,
he answered the unseen voice.
She died right after giving birth to me. My father.
Tifa caught sight of a slight smile spread on Sephiroth's face. She was surprised. That smile, although not polite in the least, was so unlike the cruel and calculating smile that she had seen on his other avatar. Of course, she had almost forgotten. Sephiroth had once been more than just a powerful soldier. He had been a respected leader, and a role model to all young men. She shivered as Sephiroth began to laugh, his hand over his mouth to hide his smile.
But to tell you the truth, I thought he was very cold,
she admitted. Sephiroth finally stopped laughing and took a breath. He shook his head. His long silver bangs swayed across his face.
What does it matter?
He asked. He turned towards the town.
All right, let's go.
He walked forward.
I remember, I felt a foreboding about him.
Tifa looked down and bit her lip. 3 more lucid figures appeared behind him and approached the town. One of the figures was Cloud, standing at the rear of the trio. The other 2 were Shinra soldiers in pressed blue uniforms. The 3 became solid as they stepped onto the stone path, and came to a stop before Tifa and Cloud. Cloud raised his eyes and gazed upon the memory of himself as he was 5 years ago. This was as he remembered it, himself entering Nibelheim with Sephiroth. He walked forward and stepped into the image, which rippled as he did so. The 2 merged as one being. Cloud then looked at Tifa, to see her response. Tifa's eyes saddened, and she shook her head regretfully.
No, Cloud,
she said. Her heart ached in her chest. Unable to bear the pain, she turned away from him.
I've been hiding it for some time, afraid that if I told you, something terrible might happen. But, I'm not going to hide anything anymore.
At this, Sephiroth and the 2 soldiers vanished, leaving only Cloud. Tifa took a deep breath, sighed heavily, and then turned to face him. His eyes were fixed on her. His expression was earnest, yet fearful. Tifa felt her heart wrench in her chest, but she had no choice now. The truth had to be told. She took another deep breath and said,
You weren't here. Cloud did not come to Nibelheim 5 years ago.
These were the words Cloud had feared. He lowered his head. A look of anguish crossed his face, and Tifa thought her heart might break in 2. As hard as it was, Cloud had to know the truth now. There was no turning back. Another person appeared by the town entrance. It was Tifa, as she was 5 years ago. She was sitting on the dusty path with her eyes fixed on the floor. Her hands played absently with the laces of her knee-high boots. She looked as though she was waiting for someone. Every so often the younger Tifa would look up and gaze out of the town, but then her eyes would return to the ground, and she would sigh sadly. Tifa gazed upon her younger self. Their expressions were mirrored.
I waited, said Tifa. But, Cloud never came.
Her younger self suddenly lifted her head, as though she had heard something. She stood and looked down the path.
The 2 that were ordered here were Sephiroth and another person.
As they watched, the younger Tifa's eyes opened wide as she spotted someone approaching down the path. Swiftly she turned and ran back into the town, leaving a trail of dust in her wake. Sephiroth's image returned in her place, and he turned to look down the path.
All right, let's go,
he said. The 2 soldiers reappeared, walking past Cloud and coming to stand near to Sephiroth. Cloud turned to look behind him as a 3rd figure drew near. His eyes widened, his face paled. It was not him who was walking up to the gates of Nibelheim. It was somebody else. A different soldier. He was also wearing the uniform of the Shinra soldier 1st class. He was taller than Cloud, with a strong, well-built frame. His face was kind and he was probably no older than 20, if that. His eyes were blue and had the same bright glow that was the trademark of all members of Soldier. Cloud stared at the young soldier, his eyes growing wider. Strapped to the young man's back was the Buster sword, the same sword that Cloud was wearing at this very moment. His hand strayed towards it, but he froze as the young man came to a stop before him and looked around at his surroundings. His eyes met Cloud's, although he did not see him. A white light filled the landscape, and the young man and Nibelheim faded from view. When it faded, Cloud and Tifa were back on the stone platform, just outside of Nibelheim. The young man was gone.
You mean,
Cloud whispered, his voice shaking,
that member of Soldier who came with Sephiroth wasn't? Cloud. There's nothing I can say,
said Tifa. She turned away from him again.
You must find the answer yourself. If you can't, then you.
She cut herself short, refusing to finish what she had been going to say. It was not for her to decide what would happen if Cloud could not find the truth within himself. It was all up to Cloud. All she could do was stand with him as he uncovered it, piece by piece. She was worried that Cloud would try to rush and force some kind of truth from his memories, in his desperation to find himself. She saw that desperation, that yearning, in his eyes. Tifa straightened her face and turned back to him.
Take your time, Cloud,
she said. Her voice was soft but stern.
Slowly. Little by little, okay.
Cloud looked back at her and his blue eyes filled with a longing for the truth. He looked back at Nibelheim. Tifa watched him, and she wondered what thoughts were going through his head right then. She could not even begin to guess, but she could tell by the spasm of pain that crossed his features that they were troubling. His fists clenched, then relaxed. Cloud lowered his head and sank slowly to the floor, sitting once more on the path, staring into the town. Tifa returned to the central podium. There was nothing she could say that would ease Cloud's fears. For better or worse, he had to uncover the truth behind himself. There was no time for false promises or kid gloves. She came to a stop in the middle of the platform and looked at the two remaining paths, wondering which one she should take next. The platform to her right held an image of the old wooden well in the middle of Nibelheim. The other platform was still a mystery to her. No matter how hard she tried, she could not figure out what that window was meant to symbolize. She started to head towards it, but then changed her mind and headed towards the other platform. She stopped on the path behind Cloud, who sat gazing up at the well. Sensing her presence behind him, Cloud stirred and rose to his feet. His gaze rose above the well, to the eerie luminescent sky, and he shook his head sadly.
That starry night at the well. And our promise that night. What if the memory was just a lie? Don't hurry, Cloud,
Tifa told him softly.
Don't answer too quickly.
She reached out and brushed her fingertips against his arm. Her touch drew Cloud's gaze away from the sky, and he glanced over his shoulder to look at her.
Just keep checking all those small emotions and it'll come back,
she said.
Slowly. Little by little. Right. Like the sky that night. The heavens were filled with stars.
Cloud's eyes half closed as he tried to remember the scene. The landscape stirred, and the glowing green sky shifted and grew darker, until it was a beautiful nighttime blue. The sun was still setting in the distance, and the horizon was a mid-blue. Stars emerged from the heavens, twinkling with their own inner light. Looking up, Tifa felt herself getting lost in the vast ocean of stars. Yes, this was the sky she remembered. Tifa pulled her gaze away from the stars and looked over at Cloud. He, too, was gazing up at the stars. The fighter reached out and touched his arm, drawing his attention once more. He looked at her, and she smiled.
From the beginning. Okay.
End of chapter. Episode 15, Part 12, Chapter 14. Chapter 14. Cloud and Tifa stood together on the old well. The buildings of Nibelheim were all around them, dark and silent. Only the inn remained in full light as business went on well into the night. Tifa ignored the town and kept her eyes fixed on Cloud, who in turn kept his eyes lowered to stare at the wooden planks.
Try and remember, Cloud,
said Tifa, and Cloud raised his gaze slightly, looking at the corner of the well. Two small figures appeared, sitting on the corner between him and Tifa. One of those figures was Cloud as he was 7 years ago, aged just 14, tapping his feet against the wood. The other was Tifa, aged 13. Tifa examined the memory of her younger self closely. She paid particular attention to the way her younger self was dressed, a beautiful turquoise dress, and high-heeled shoes.
Right, I was wearing these clothes,
she said, nodding satisfactorily. She then turned her attention to the younger Cloud, in his white t-shirt, still tapping his feet against the wood with a nervous look on his face.
That's you, too. You were so small then.
She sat down beside her younger self, imitating the way she sat. She smiled, a soft, tender smile.
And cute.
Tifa turned her head to look at Cloud. At the same time, her younger self also turned and looked at her own Cloud. At Tifa's gaze, Cloud looked away, unable to face her.
Sephiroth once said,
began Tifa.
Cloud made up his memories by listening to my stories.
She raised her eyes to the starry sky above them.
Did you imagine this sky? No, you remembered it.
The fighter drew her knees up to her chest as she gazed up at the stars. The beautiful stars, thousands upon thousands of them, glittered and twinkled in the sky. Tifa knew that up there in the sky, thousands of planets were being born. New life would emerge from the life stream, just as they did on this one. A never-ending cycle of new life all there in that single sky. Tifa closed her eyes, remembering that night.
That night the stars were gorgeous. It was just Cloud and I. We talked at the well.
She exhaled softly, and opened her eyes.
That's why I continued to believe that you were the real Cloud. I still believe you're the Cloud from Nibelheim.
As she talked, the young Cloud and Tifa continued on in silent conversation. Their lips moved voicelessly, oblivious to the presence of the older versions beside them. After a while, the young Cloud stood up and faced Tifa. He spoke, and his words caused Tifa to stare in awe. Cloud then walked away from them all and went round to the back of the well. A few moments later, he appeared at the top of the well and looked up at the sky, seeing his dreams in the stars.
But you don't believe in yourself,
continued Tifa. She, too, raised her eyes to the heavens, and this time her eyes were filled with sadness.
These memories aren't enough.
The memories of their younger selves faded. Cloud and Tifa returned to the stone path. Tifa's face was troubled, her brow creased in deep thought. After walking a few paces, she stopped and turned to Cloud.
Cloud, what about your other memories? No, not memories,
she said, shaking her head.
A memory is something that has to be consciously recalled, right? That's why it can sometimes be mistaken for a different thing.
Her brow creased further as she trailed off. Cloud watched her as she mulled things over in her mind, talking quietly to herself.
But it's different from a memory locked deep within your heart,
she whispered.
That's why it must be a fake. If he could recall up that memory.
That's it, she announced, slamming her fist triumphantly into her palm.
What about some memory that has to do with me? I say something and you don't remember it. But you say something, and I remember it, too. Then we'll know that's our memory. Talk to me. About anything, some important memory to you. Now that you mention it, why did you want to join Soldier in the first place? I always thought it was a sudden decision you made.
She looked to Cloud, waiting for his response. His expression was pained, as though even this memory tortured him deep inside. I was devastated. I wanted to be noticed.
I was devastated. I wanted to be noticed,
answered Cloud finally. His words were soft, barely above a whisper.
Someone to notice you? Who?
Who? You know who. You, that's who. Cloud sighed heavily.
You.
Tifa blinked.
Me? Why? Tifa. Did you forget about those days?
The fighter jumped, startled. Those words had not been spoken by the Cloud standing before her, but from someone else. Quickly, Tifa turned to look behind her. Sitting on a pillar around the central platform was Cloud. A young Cloud, just as he was 7 years ago. He sat there, one knee drawn up to his chest, and the other swinging back and forth, his heel tapping the stone. Tifa stared up at him, her eyes wide, wondering if he was the one who had spoken, or if he was another memory summoned by Cloud's subconscious. The young Cloud raised his head and met Tifa's gaze. His eyes were different from the Cloud she knew. They did not have the Mako-induced glow. However, they were alert and responsive. Although they did not have the same Mako glow that Cloud had, they were very piercing, staring at Tifa intently.
Look.
Tifa shook her head.
I'm sorry. But what are you talking about?
The young Cloud pulled up his other knee and stood up. He peered over the edge of the pillar, measured the distance, and then jumped off. He walked to the middle of the platform.
No. It's all right,
he said, though his voice sounded sad.
You were having a hard time back then. You were so busy with your own things, it's only natural you don't remember me back then.
Tifa walked back to the central platform, leaving Cloud to turn and sit back down on the path, staring up at the well. The fighter walked until she was just a few feet from the younger Cloud. There she stopped, watching him.
Back then?
She asked. Cloud nodded. Then he looked down and bit his lip.
It's important to me. I hate to say it, but it's a very important memory. Do you want to see it?
His eyes strayed across to the final path, to the closed window that lay at its end. Tifa looked at the window, too. Once more she felt that she knew this window somehow. There was something very familiar about it, and yet unfamiliar at the same time. Where had she seen this window before? She walked down the path towards the window, the eyes of the young Cloud upon her. She walked up to the final Cloud, sitting on the path looking up at the closed window. Sensing her presence, Cloud stirred and spoke.
A sealed-up secret. Wish. Tender memories. No one can ever know.
Cloud stood up and stepped aside, allowing Tifa to pass. The young Cloud ran past her and went to the window, beckoning her to follow. Tifa did so and stopped beside him. Together they looked at the window. It was simple, made of wood, with glass that was slightly dusty. Tifa leaned forward and stared, trying to see inside. Was that a room she could see on the other side?
Do you know where this window goes to, Tifa?
The young Cloud asked. Tifa shook her head, not taking her eyes from the window. Cloud smiled softly.
Fine.
He said.
I'll go.
He looked back at the window. Tifa did the same. She stared at the window, waiting for something to happen. She blinked, and when she opened her eyes she was startled to find that she was no longer standing outside the window. She was now standing inside a room that she knew very well.
My room.
Cloud nodded.
It was my first time there.
It was indeed Tifa's bedroom, from her old home in Nibelheim. Tifa turned on the spot and looked around her. Everything was just as she remembered it. There was her bed, large and comfortable, with her favorite cuddly toy sitting by the wall. Her dressing table, her wardrobes, even her piano was here. She turned round and round, taking it all in. She turned towards the wardrobe, and stopped in surprise. Sitting in the corner by the wardrobe was Cloud. He didn't seem to be paying any attention to her, or to his younger self, who was standing just beside her. He was looking at the window. Now Tifa remembered the window. It was her bedroom window, but only from the outside. No wonder she hadn't recognized it. She then realized what the young Cloud had said, and she turned away from the window to look at him in bewilderment.
Was
it? She asked, confused. Cloud nodded.
I only used to look up at it from outside.
Tifa opened her mouth to speak, but before she could utter a word there was a second flash of bright white light. When the light faded, there were 4 more people standing in the room with them. One of those Tifa recognized as herself, aged just 8. She was huddled in the corner between the bed and the window, her knees drawn up to her chest, her head buried in her knees. Her hair fell thick around her face, hiding it from view. Standing around her were 3 boys of a similar age. Her closest friends. Tifa took a step towards them. A wistful look came into her eyes, and her vision misted over as tears threatened to well up and pour down her cheeks. These boys. She had almost forgotten about them, it had been so long. She longed to reach out and touch them, to see if they were real. The boys gathered close around her younger self, awkward and sympathetic looks on their faces. Tifa started to reach out her hand when the boy by the window suddenly moved and looked out.
"Hey, look! Cloud's coming!"
he said. Tifa halted in her movement and quickly turned her gaze to the window. She hadn't noticed before, but the landscape outside the window had changed. It was no longer the platforms and the paths, but the town of Nibelheim. She could see the well in the center of town, and the inn behind it. She lowered her gaze and saw Cloud running towards the house. He ran up to the gate and stopped, looking up at the window. The boy by the window looked back down at him. Cloud didn't seem to have seen him, and he made no move to approach the house. He simply stood by the gate, looking up.
"You think he wants to come in?"
the boy asked, looking at Tifa. Tifa did not answer. In fact, she did not seem the least bit interested in anything that was being said. She raised her head slightly, but her hair kept her face hidden from view. She said nothing, and put her head back on her knees. Outside, Cloud finally seemed to make up his mind and ran into the garden, heading for the front door. Tifa stepped back away from the window. Something seemed to be troubling her, and she turned to the young Cloud standing beside her.
"Was that the first day you came into my room?"
she asked. She thought harder, and then she sighed.
"That's right. We lived next to each other. But I didn't really know you that well. I've known you since we were children and always thought we were close."
She sighed again. At the same time, her younger self raised her head again and shook it slowly. She did not want Cloud to come in. Tifa took her gaze from them and scanned the room.
"Now that you mention it,"
she added,
"I don't recall you ever being in my room."
Cloud nodded. He looked over at the three boys gathered around Tifa.
"Tifa was always with this threesome." "That's right."
Tifa smiled.
"I used to think they were all stupid."
Tifa spun round to face him, her eyes wide with shock.
"What?"
Cloud scowled and looked away, refusing to look at her or the other boys in front of him.
"You were all so childish," he said curtly, "laughing at every little stupid thing." "But we were children, back then," protested Tifa.
Cloud's features softened. A guilty look crossed his face and he turned away sheepishly.
"I know. I'm the one that was stupid,"
he admitted.
"I really wanted to play with everyone, but I was never allowed into the group. Then later, I began to think I was different. That I was different from those immature kids. That then, maybe."
He fell silent, flushing in embarrassment. A second flash of light filled the room. Tifa turned to the far corner, to where Cloud was still sitting silently. His image wavered, and as Tifa watched, a second Cloud emerged from the form of the first. His image flickered, becoming engulfed in a dark shadow almost every few seconds, as though he was not quite complete. He stood beside his young self. His voice echoed in the room, though his mouth did not move.
"Just maybe, they would invite me in. I thought that might happen, so I hung around." "I was so prejudiced," said the young Cloud regretfully. "And weak." At this, he clenched his fists tight, until the knuckles turned bone white. He bit his lip and glared at the floor. His body began to shake, as though unable to contain his anger. "That night I called Tifa out to the well. I thought to myself Tifa would never come. That she hated me. Yeah. It was so sudden. I was a bit surprised." Tifa thought back to that evening, the evening Cloud announced he would be leaving Nibelheim for Midgar. "But it's true that we weren't that close, but after you left town, I really thought about you a lot. I used to wonder how Cloud was doing. I wonder if Cloud was able to get into Soldier." She looked down and smiled, her cheeks flushing faintly. "I started reading the newspapers, thinking that there might be an article about you." The young Cloud relaxed his fists and looked up at her. There was a gentle smile on his face. "Thanks, Tifa. Tell him what you told me, later. He'll probably be so happy." "Okay," said Tifa. She was happy to see such a sweet smile on his face. Now that she thought about it, the Cloud that she knew from her journeys had never smiled like that.
It was nice to see that smile, if only on the face of a memory. She returned her attention to the room and to the 4 figures still in the corner.
Hey! What happened on this day? Was it a special day?
The instant the words were out of her mouth, Tifa knew she was wrong. It was a special day, but not special like a birthday or a wedding day. The atmosphere, the feeling, it was all wrong. Her friends all had worried looks on their faces, and her younger self was huddled up in the corner, trying to hide her face. Tifa's heart clenched tight as she suddenly realized what day this memory had come from. The smile vanished from the young Cloud's face. He turned to face her.
This was the day.
He began, but could not finish. His adult self shook his head and looked away.
Tifa's mother.
Tifa finished it.
The day Mom died.
Her younger self finally raised her head, and her face became visible through the long lengths of hair. Her eyes were red, her cheeks wet with tears. She struggled to meet the eyes of her friends. Eventually she gave up and put her head back on her knees, her hair hiding her face once again.
I want to see Mom,
she said brokenly. She then stood and fled the room. Tifa felt tears come into her eyes. Had it really been 12 years since this day? She was ashamed to admit it, but she had almost completely forgotten about the day her mother died. The memories of Sephiroth and the things he did, including the murder of her father, had shadowed many of Tifa's other memories. It was sad. Tifa caught her tears with the back of her hand, overcome, remembering the grief and loss.
I wonder if there's anything beyond that mountain?
Asked Tifa curiously. She and her 3 friends stood on the winding path at the foot of Mount Nebel, looking up at the mountain. The tears had now gone from Tifa's face, wiped away in anger as she stormed out of the house to come here. Her friends had come with her to this place, though they had no idea why she had come here. They simply followed her. One of the boys stood further down the path and turned to her.
Mount Nebel is scary, he said. Many people have died there. No one crosses that mountain alive,
said the boy behind her. Tifa turned to them, her eyes flashing in earnest.
How about those that died?
She asked.
Did Mama pass through the mountain?
She looked up at the mountain, with its grey, lifeless rocks, dipping paths, and treacherous passes. The children of Nibelheim were always told that they were forbidden to play here. In fact, this was the closest Tifa had ever come to Mount Nebel, and that she stood before it, she was filled with a deep longing to know what was on the other side. Perhaps the dead did cross the mountain and wait on the other side for the living to come and find them. Perhaps her mother was there, waiting for her to come. With this thought in mind, Tifa's face settled in determination. She walked forward, past her friends, and stopped ahead of them. She raised her eyes to the mountain.
I'm going,
she proclaimed, and then carried on walking boldly down the path. 2 of the boys walked after her, mimicking Tifa's brave face and confident stride. The 3rd boy, however, was not so quick to follow them. He looked up at the mountain. The mountain was dangerous and filled with monsters, and although he was loyal to Tifa and to his friends, he did not dare follow them into the mountain. He shuffled uncomfortably, watching, before he turned and fled from the mountain. On his way he passed Cloud, who had followed the group after they had left Tifa's house. He had not approached them but stayed a little way behind, just out of sight. Cloud watched in surprise as the boy ran past without even noticing him, heading back to town. Cloud turned and looked down the path. He saw Tifa and the other 2 boys further down. They had reached the mountain now. They did not seem to have noticed that the 3rd boy was not with them. Either they didn't notice or they didn't care, for they never even looked back to check. Without hesitation Cloud ran after them. Tifa kept on walking until she reached the bridge. The bridge was years old and in very bad repair, and as such was likely very unstable. Tifa paid no attention to this and strode onto it without even altering her pace. Her heels clicked against the old wood, which creaked beneath her weight, but Tifa was unconcerned. Her mother was waiting for her on the other side of this mountain, and no rickety old bridge was going to stop her from getting there. Her two friends also stepped onto the bridge. The boy in front suddenly stopped, and his friend almost walked into him. Their confidence and resolve to follow Tifa all the way had faltered the further along the path they walked. The four of them had always talked about ignoring their parents and crossing Mount Nebel, but in truth it had always just been talk, no more than a game. To actually do it and cross the mountain was a different matter entirely. So they stopped. They did not call out to Tifa or try to dissuade her from crossing. They just stopped, looked at each other, nodded, and they also turned and ran away. They also passed Cloud, who was following just a short way behind and had just reached the bridge. Like before, neither of the two boys gave Cloud a second thought as they hurried back down the path. Cloud went to the edge of the bridge and looked up at Tifa, who continued to walk confidently across the bridge even though her friends had now abandoned her. It was possible she had not even noticed they were gone, or if they had followed her in the first place. She held her head high defiantly, all her thoughts fixed on making it through the mountain. Cloud stared up at her. He could not believe that Tifa's friends had abandoned her. What was more amazing was that Tifa continued on even though she was alone. Cloud had hoped, that if he followed Tifa and her friends into the mountain, they might see him and invite him along on their quest. Now Tifa was alone. It was up to him now to make sure that nothing happened to her. He hurried onto the bridge. When Tifa next opened her eyes, she was standing in an area filled with a bright white light. Cloud was standing beside her, with his shadow standing between them. Their eyes were fixed directly ahead. Lying on the ground a few feet away were Cloud and Tifa. Cloud was on his back, dazed. His knees were scraped raw and bleeding, but otherwise he looked okay. Tifa, on the other hand, looked in very bad shape. She had cuts and bruises all over her body from where she had fallen, and her dress was covered in dirt. Blood leaked from a cut on her head where she had hit it against a rock. She was not moving.
I don't remember the path I walked,
the shadow Cloud was saying. There was a deep sadness in his voice.
Tifa missed her step. I ran to her, but didn't make it in time. Both of us fell off the cliff. Back then, I only scarred my knees, but...
He fell silent as a man stepped into the light. He saw the two youngsters lying there, and when he saw Tifa covered in dirt and with blood across her face, he cried out and ran to her side. Another man ran in behind him. Tifa recognized him instantly, it was her father. He must have come to the mountain looking for her. Her father stared at her younger self, and then turned to Cloud, his eyes blazing with anger.
Cloud! Why did you bring Tifa to a place like this?
Her father shouted angrily, shaking his fist. The other man gently scooped Tifa up in his arms, careful to keep her head as still as possible. At the sound of her father's voice, Cloud's body twitched and he slowly raised his head, groaning.
What the hell is the matter with you?
Her father was practically screaming at him. Cloud ignored him and looked over at Tifa, who was being carried away by the other man. He caught a glimpse of her face as she was carried away. Her eyes were closed as though she was sleeping, and she looked pale. Blood covered half of her face, and her hair was matted with it. She was not moving. Cloud paled at the sight of her and he shook his head. No, it wasn't real. He struggled to sit up. Tifa's father was burning with a rage so hot it was almost physical.
What if she dies?
He yelled. He then cursed and walked away, following the man who held his daughter. They left Cloud behind, sitting there alone. Cloud closed his eyes and clenched his fists tight. Tifa watched all this in utter silence. Of course, she remembered it now. She'd been striding along the bridge and not really looking where she was going. All her thoughts had been fixed on making it across the mountain and finding her mother. She had been close to reaching the other side when the plank beneath her split apart. She vaguely remembered hearing someone call out her name before she fell. And that was the last thing she remembered of that day.
Tifa was in a coma for 7 days,
she heard Cloud's voice say.
We all thought she wouldn't make it. If only I could have saved her. I was so angry. Angry at myself for my weakness. Ever since then, I felt Tifa blamed me. I got out of control. I'd get into fights not even caring who it was.
The images faded, and everything returned to blackness.
That was the first time I heard about Sephiroth. If I got strong like Sephiroth, then everyone might.
They were now standing on the path in Memoria outside the memory of Tifa's bedroom window, just Tifa, Cloud, and his shadow. The young Cloud had vanished along with the final memory. The shadow Cloud tried to look at Tifa, but faltered, and was forced to look away.
If I could just get stronger,
he said.
Then even Tifa would have to notice me. So that was it.
Breathed Tifa, nodding slightly. Yes, everything made sense now. Cloud's reason for joining Soldier. It was all because of that day. He had failed to protect her that day, and that failure made him decide that he would join Soldier, Shinra's most elite fighting unit. So that, next time, he wouldn't fail.
Sorry, Cloud. If I had remembered more clearly what happened, I could have done something sooner.
The other Cloud stepped forward and shook his head.
It's not your fault, Tifa.
Tifa turned away, thinking.
But, I remember back when we were 8.
She said. She thought harder, and then her eyes lit up.
That's it. Now I know.
She turned back.
You weren't created 5 years ago. My childhood memories weren't all made up. Hang in there, Cloud. Just a little longer. You've almost found the real you.
The two Clouds nodded. There was a little more confidence in their expressions, as though pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together at last. Tifa turned away again and looked around her. Her eyes strayed to the path on the other side of the platform, the path that led to the memory of Nibelheim. She nodded.
Let's go back to Nibelheim again.
The two Clouds stared, confused, and then slowly nodded. Yes. If there was an answer to the puzzle of his memories, then it would be in Nibelheim. Everything began with Nibelheim, and there it would end. His shadow self raised his head and walked up to him. The two joined, merging together until they were one. Cloud then nodded again, this time more firmly. He then ran past Tifa towards the Nibelheim path. Tifa followed, watching him. The truth was there, in Nibelheim. End of chapter.